We know we got to do our job right. I spent some time in Iraq and Afghanistan with our troops. Credible young people, but I think every one of you was an incredible person at the time that you served. I watched as they medically evacuated wounded soldiers, got them to the forward hospitals, did what they could, and then they could be in Germany at Landstuhl, in the best surgical hospital in the world. They could be there in 7-8 hours after they are wounded. And as a result of that incredible system that's been set up, if you survive the battlefield injury, you will have a 95% chance of being alive. That's an incredible statistic, incredible statistic. Not in the history of warfare has there been that kind of ability to save our young men and women. But that means many of them are injured to an extent that in previous wars they would have been dead. That means we have some real long-term obligations. And we got to meet those obligations. It's a part of the cost of war to deal with the warriors. I don't care what it costs. We got to do it. We got to do it. You know, George Washington had it right over 220 years ago. He said, the biggest factor in the morale of our fighting troops is the sense of how they're going to be treated when they come home. So we do this job not for just those who are injured, but for those who are still on the battlefield. We got to do this job right. And I will tell you, we were not prepared. The average soldier in a tour will have 7 concussions in Iraq or Afghanistan. And if that doesn't lead to shrapnel in a leg or an arm, it's going to be additive in terms of the brain injury that occurs. As we know from football players with their concussions, this is additive. And brain injury, and we have a name traumatic brain injury, but somehow you can have a mild form of traumatic brain injury. I don't know how you do that. It's like being a little bit pregnant, I guess. But if you have a brain injury, you're not going to function either on the battlefield to your highest ability or when you come back home. So we've got to deal with all that. We've got to diagnose it. We've got to adequately understand it. And as most of you know from being in combat, as some people have said, is it's the toughest thing anybody could face. And aside from physical wounds, there are mental wounds, mental injuries. We summarize it now with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people don't want to face it in the armed forces. Our commanders don't necessarily want it. They say, Marine, soldier, suck it up. It's all in your head. People make fun maybe of their comrades if they try to seek help. They call it, go into the pink room, see the wizard. There's a dynamic against both figuring out what you have and admitting it and dealing with it. We've got to get rid of that stigma because we know that, and I don't like PTSD. It sounds like you're strange. It's a disorder. It's combat stress injury. As someone said, it's a normal response to an abnormal situation, and it's real. You have got to deal with it if you're going to become a complete citizen again, and we can deal with it. We know how to deal with it, but there's a dynamic against admitting of it. People don't want to know about it. In many ways, the Department of Defense, the VA, don't want to know about it because it costs money to treat. And so we got literally tens of thousands of young people from this war, not to mention earlier wars, who are suffering from PTSD. We need to help them, and they're not in the system. We know what happens if you don't treat it. Domestic violence at home, alcohol and drug abuse, loss of job, loss of family, loss of home, suicide. We know exactly what's going to happen. And yet, we are not diagnosing these young people in a mandatory way when they get out, especially the National Guard units. So people are getting out without admitting it to themselves, without their knowing about it, and that's going to cause problems. We saw it. We know exactly what it's going to cause. We need to make sure that every young person that gets out is adequately diagnosed, not just with a self-questionnaire, but competent medical personnel to make sure we know if they have brain injury or PTSD. Because if we don't do it, it's going to cost us way more down the line, I'll tell you, way more down the line if we don't do it now. We have got to make sure that mental health is as important as the physical health in this country. And yet you've heard stories. We get misdiagnosis of PTSD. People are saying, no, you have a pre-existing condition called a personality disorder. Well, I don't know why we took you in if you had a personality disorder, but once you did, we got an obligation to take care of you. But they say pre-existing condition, like your HMO sometimes, that means they don't have to treat you. It's a hell of a way to save money by not treating PTSD. We've discovered emails of VA administrators who tell their staff, don't diagnose PTSD, it's costing us too much. We don't have the resources. Call it an associative disorder or something. That's criminal, in my opinion. We cannot do that to our people. So we have got to put both the resources in place and have a culture that understands that this is important. That culture is pretty hard to change, by the way. One of your former executive directors became the VA secretary, Jesse Brown. He did an incredible job. When the president didn't give him a budget that was adequate, he barged into the Oval Office and said, I'm not going to support this. Give me a budget. We haven't had, I think, as aggressive defense of veterans since Jesse left us. But we need to do that. We need to do that. I don't care if it's the budget. I don't care if it's PTSD. I don't care what it is. We have got to make the argument for the resources that we need. Then we have to make sure that they do a good job. In recent hearings of the Veterans Department, Veterans Affairs Committee, we've had officials from the VA and the DOD say things like, suicide's not a problem. There are, right now, CBS News discovered this, and it took the VA time to finally accept it. 15 to 18 suicides per day of your comrades right now. They finally set up a hotline. They get 1,000 attempts per month at the VA. And I'm saying this is an epidemic. This is a national emergency. The secretary says, well, it's no different than if you were not a veteran. I couldn't care less. We got to do the job for our veterans. You got to do whatever it takes to make sure that this stops. We had a top official in the Department of Defense, when I asked him about the figures that the RAND Corporation recently came up with, over 300,000 young people with PTSD in Iraq, 320,000 with brain injury. I said, doesn't that mean we got to do more? And this guy had the nerve to say, well, they only have symptoms of PTSD or brain injury. Only a few, and that's a quote, only a few have full-fledged PTSD or brain injury. If you have that kind of attitude at the top, what's going to happen throughout the system? You're going to have an unresponsiveness. You're going to have people who don't take seriously what these issues are. And from Agent Orange and to the present day, lots of people continue to fight the VA. They think VA means Veterans Adversary. I think VA should mean Veterans Advocate, and we should be fighting for each and every one of you.